In the final months of the war, across the scattered islands and territories of the Pacific, there were thousands of Japanese women far from home. Some were military nurses, trained to care for wounded soldiers. Others were comfort station workers, clerks, teachers, or civilians who had followed the expanding empire to Manchuria, the Philippines, Saipan, or Okinawa. They had lived under the structure of imperial military rule, their days measured by duty and obedience, their nights filled with the sounds of distant artillery and whispered prayers. And as the empire began to crumble in 1945, as American forces advanced island by island, these women began to hear warnings. Not from official broadcasts, not from generals, but from the quiet, desperate voices of soldiers and civilians around them. The Americans are coming, they were told. And when they arrive, terrible things will happen. The propaganda had been relentless. For years, the Japanese military government had painted the enemy as savage, as barbaric monsters who would show no mercy to Japanese women. Stories circulated, some invented, some exaggerated from isolated incidents of unspeakable violence. The message was always the same: capture meant something worse than death. Better to die with honor than fall into enemy hands. And so, in those final weeks, as the sound of American planes grew louder and the night skies flashed with distant explosions, many women made quiet preparations. Some carried cyanide capsules, small and bitter, tucked into pockets or sewn into hems. Others sharpened bamboo stakes or gathered rope. In caves on Saipan and cliffs on Okinawa, women held their children close and made unthinkable choices, choosing to leap rather than be captured. This was the fear they carried. Not an abstract fear, but a deep, bodily terror that had been carefully cultivated by years of wartime messaging. They had been taught that the enemy was not human, that mercy was impossible, that surrender meant the end of everything they knew. But here is where our story turns, because what these women had been told, and what actually happened, were two very different things. When the first American soldiers appeared, dusty and tired, carrying rations and medical supplies instead of weapons drawn, something unexpected began to unfold. It happened slowly, tentatively, in the space between expectation and reality. It happened in field hospitals and prison camps and temporary shelters, in 1,000 small moments of confusion and hesitation, and then, cautiously, relief. The women who had prepared to die found themselves, instead, being offered water. And in that simple gesture, in the quiet confusion of receiving kindness when they had been promised cruelty, the first cracks appeared in the wall of fear that had been built around them. The hearth of war had burned so hot for so long, but now, in the ash and rubble, something else was beginning to take shape. Something gentler. Something human. And outside the makeshift tents where these first encounters happened, the tropical rain fell softly on palm leaves, washing away the smoke of yesterday's battles. Picture a field hospital, hastily erected near the coast of Okinawa in the summer of 1945. Canvas tents flapping in the warm breeze. The smell of disinfectant mixing with salt air. Inside, rows of cots, and on them, Japanese soldiers, wounded, exhausted, and among them, a handful of Japanese nurses who had chosen to stay with their patients rather than flee. They had made their choice expecting the worst. They sat in silence, eyes downcast, waiting for violence. Some had hidden small blades in their clothing. Others simply closed their eyes and prayed. And then the American medics arrived. What happened next was recorded in dozens of journals and letters, in official reports and personal memoirs, and the pattern was remarkably consistent. The American soldiers, young men from farms in Iowa and cities like Detroit, most of them barely in their 20s, looked at these frightened women and saw, not enemies, but nurses. People who had been doing the same work they were doing. People who looked exhausted and scared. One nurse later recalled, through a translator years after the war, that the first American soldier she saw was carrying a box of medical supplies. He set it down gently. He didn't shout. He didn't advance. He simply gestured to the supplies, pointed to the wounded Japanese soldiers, and in broken, awkward gestures, made it clear that the medical work would continue. That she could help. That she was safe. She didn't believe it at first. None of them did. They waited for the trap, for the moment when the kindness would twist into cruelty. But the moment never came. Instead, over the next hours and days, something remarkable unfolded. American medics worked alongside Japanese nurses to treat wounded soldiers from both sides. Language barriers made communication difficult, but medicine has its own language. A bandage is a bandage. A patient in pain is a patient in pain. And slowly, so slowly, the tension began to ease. Food was shared. Not luxurious food, but rations, tinned meat, crackers, chocolate bars that the American soldiers divided up and offered to the Japanese women who hadn't eaten properly in weeks. Some women refused at first, suspecting poison. But hunger is a powerful thing, and when the Americans ate from the same tins, the women began to accept. There were moments of confusion, of course. Cultural misunderstandings. A soldier offering a cigarette to a woman who had never smoked. A nurse flinching when someone moved too quickly. But there was no violence. No assault. No confirmation of the terrible warnings they had carried. In the prison camps being established across the Pacific, the pattern repeated. Japanese women, terrified, expecting abuse, instead found themselves in guarded compounds where they were given shelter, food, and medical care. The guards kept their distance. There were rules strictly enforced about conduct and respect. Violations were punished. One woman, interviewed decades later for a documentary, remembered her first meal in an American POW camp. Rice. Actual rice, not the watery gruel they'd been surviving on. And canned fruit. She had expected starvation, or worse. Instead, she was handed a tray of food and told, through gestures, to eat. She cried. Not from fear, but from the overwhelming confusion of kindness received when cruelty had been promised. And outside the camp fences, the evening breeze carried the scent of ocean salt and distant cooking fires, and the world kept turning, quieter now. Trust doesn't return all at once after it has been broken, or after it has been built on lies. It comes back in small pieces, like a mosaic being assembled one tile at a time. And for the Japanese women in American custody in the late summer and autumn of 1945, trust came back in the smallest of moments. A guard learning to say, "Ohayou," good morning, in Japanese, his pronunciation clumsy but his effort genuine. A doctor taking the time to explain, through an interpreter, what medicine he was administering and why. An officer enforcing rules that protected the women from harassment, not just from other prisoners, but from his own soldiers. These were the moments that mattered. Not grand gestures, not dramatic declarations, but the quiet, consistent demonstration that the world they had been promised was not the world they were experiencing. In the camps, routines developed. The women were allowed to organize themselves, to maintain their own living spaces, to prepare food in familiar ways when ingredients allowed. Some camps had small gardens where the women could grow vegetables. This was not just practical, it was psychological. It gave them agency, control, the ability to shape their days rather than simply endure them. Japanese cultural structures remained, hierarchies based on age and social position, and the Americans, for the most part, didn't interfere. They understood, perhaps instinctively, that allowing people to maintain their identity was part of treating them with dignity. There were English lessons, informal and optional. Some women attended out of curiosity. Others out of practical necessity, realizing that communication would make their lives easier. The teachers were often soldiers with no formal training, just patience and a willingness to try. The lessons were simple. Numbers. Colors. Please. Thank you. Words that built bridges. And slowly, So slowly, some of the women began to smile again. Not the forced smiles of obedience, but genuine expressions of relief, or amusement, or even cautious happiness. A small joke understood across languages. A child, one of the few in the camps, receiving a stick of gum from a soldier and laughing at the strange sweetness. There were still difficulties, of course. The women were prisoners, not guests. They couldn't leave. They didn't know what would happen to them, when they might go home, if they even had homes to return to. Letters were censored. Communication with the outside world was limited. The uncertainty was its own kind of weight, heavy and persistent. But the fear, that immediate, bodily terror of imminent violence, began to fade. It didn't disappear entirely. Trauma doesn't work that way, but it loosened its grip. The women began to sleep more soundly. They began to talk among themselves with less whispered urgency. They began to imagine futures again, even uncertain ones. Some women, particularly those who had been nurses or teachers, began to work within the camps. They taught children. They helped organize meal preparation. They assisted with medical care. Not because they were forced to, but because purposeful work, they discovered, was better than idle waiting. It gave shape to the days. It gave them back a sense of themselves as capable people, not just victims of circumstance. And in the evenings, when the work was done and the sun dipped low over whatever island they found themselves on, some women would sit together and sing quietly. Old songs from home. Lullabies. Folk melodies that reminded them of who they had been before the war tried to erase everything. And the tropical darkness settled gently around them, and the stars emerged, constant and unchanging. But relief, even profound relief, is rarely simple. And for many of these women, the realization that they had been lied to, that the enemy they had feared was not the monster they had been promised, brought with it a complicated tangle of emotions. There was gratitude, yes. Profound gratitude for being alive, for being treated with basic human dignity. But underneath that gratitude was something harder to name. A kind of grief, perhaps. Or anger. Or confusion so deep it had no words. They had been prepared to die. Some had watched friends and family members choose death rather than capture. On Saipan, hundreds of civilians had jumped from cliffs, mothers with children in their arms, choosing certain death over uncertain capture. And now these women, who had survived, who had surrendered or been captured, were discovering that those deaths might have been unnecessary. That the fear had been a lie. How do you hold that knowledge? How do you reconcile the relief of your own survival with the horror of what others chose based on the same false information? Some women didn't talk about it. They buried those feelings deep and focused on the practical, on the daily routines, the simple act of continuing to exist. Others talked quietly among themselves in the camps, sharing their confusion, their guilt at being relieved, their anger at the system that had taught them to fear death less than capture. And then there was the question of identity. These women had been raised in a culture that emphasized duty, honor, and loyalty to the emperor and the nation. Surrender was not just defeat, it was shame. Deep, personal shame that touched everything. The Americans didn't seem to understand this, or perhaps they understood but didn't know how to address it. To them, surrender was practical. The war was over. Going home was the next logical step. But for many Japanese women, the idea of returning home carried its own fear. What would their families think? Their communities? Would they be welcomed, or rejected as failures? Some women began to write letters home, tentative, carefully worded letters that tried to explain without fully revealing the depth of their confusion. They wrote about being safe, about hoping to return. But they often left out the details of their treatment, worried that kindness from the enemy might be interpreted as collaboration, or weakness. There were moments when the complexity became almost unbearable. A woman receiving medical care that saved her life, and then feeling ashamed that an American doctor was the one who saved her. A mother grateful that her child was being fed, but worried about what it meant that an enemy soldier was the one offering the food. These contradictions lived in the body, in tight shoulders and clenched jaws and sleepless nights. They couldn't be reasoned away. They could only be carried, held, survived. And yet, life continued. The human capacity for adaptation is extraordinary. Slowly, the women found ways to hold multiple truths at once. They could be grateful for their survival and angry about the lies they'd been told. They could accept help from former enemies without forgetting they were still enemies. They could begin to see the individual humans behind the uniforms, while still carrying the weight of their national identity. It wasn't resolution. It was coexistence. A careful balancing of irreconcilable truths. And at night, in the quiet spaces between sleep and waking, the mind does its mysterious work of processing what cannot be processed, and the breath slows, and the body rests despite everything. The war officially ended in August 1945. But for the Japanese women in Allied custody, the journey home stretched on for months, sometimes more than a year. Repatriation was a massive logistical undertaking. Ships had to be found. Routes had to be planned. Paperwork had to be processed. And all the while, these women waited, in camps that were no longer actively at war but not yet at peace. The waiting had its own rhythm. Days blended together, marked by meals, by work details, by the slow progression of seasons. Some women formed friendships during this time, bonds forged in shared experience. Others remained isolated, carrying their trauma privately, unable or unwilling to share it. Letters from home began to arrive slowly, filtering through Red Cross channels and military postal systems. The contents were often heartbreaking. Families searching for missing daughters and sisters. News of homes destroyed in bombing raids. Reports of food shortages and chaos in the immediate post-war period. The women read these letters and realized that the home they were returning to was not the home they had left. Japan itself had been transformed by defeat. And then, finally, the ships came. Large transport vessels, repurposed from military use, now carrying human cargo in the other direction. The women boarded with small bundles of possessions, often just the clothes they wore and a few items they'd managed to keep or been given. Everything else had been lost to the war. The voyage was long. Weeks at sea. The women slept in crowded holds, packed closely together, the air thick and warm. But there was also anticipation. A nervous, complicated anticipation. They were going home. But to what? To whom? Some women practiced what they would say to their families. Others decided to say nothing, to let their presence be explanation enough. Some worried they wouldn't be recognized, that the war had changed them so much, physically and emotionally, that they would be strangers in their own lives. When the ships finally approached Japan, when the coastline appeared on the horizon, familiar and yet somehow different, the women lined the rails and looked out in silence. Some cried. Some remained expressionless. Some turned away, unable to face the reality they had imagined for so long. The ports were chaotic. Crowded with returning soldiers and civilians, with aid workers and officials trying to manage the influx. Families searched for each other in the crowds, calling names, holding up photographs, desperate for reunion. And when the women finally stepped onto solid ground, onto Japanese soil, they were home. But home was different now. Broken. Rebuilding. Struggling to make sense of catastrophic defeat. Many women never spoke publicly about their experiences. The shame of surrender, the complexity of having been treated well by the enemy, these were not stories that fit easily into post-war Japanese narratives. The women carried their experiences privately, shared them only with close family, if at all, and moved forward into whatever futures they could build. But they carried something else too. A knowledge. An understanding that the world was more complicated than propaganda had taught them. That enemies could be human. That survival sometimes meant accepting help from unexpected places. That fear, even overwhelming fear, was not always based in truth. These were quiet lessons, private lessons, but they were real. And as the years passed, as Japan rebuilt and transformed, these women, now older, carried their histories forward into a changed world. And sometimes, late at night, they remembered. And the memories were complicated. But they were theirs. And the night settled softly, and rest came, as it always does, eventually. And so we come to the end of tonight's story, this quiet chapter of history about fear and expectation, and the surprising grace that can emerge from the ruins of conflict. If you're still awake, let yourself drift now. There's nothing more you need to hold. Let the images fade, let the questions rest, let your breathing carry you gently towards sleep. Thank you for listening. May your rest be deep and peaceful. Good night.